It's much better to be in a position where you're needing to hire people rapidly than a situation where you've hired too many people only to find out you don't actually need them. Hey, it's Rick Kettner here. Welcome back to the Startup Vlog. This is episode number 8, and in this episode, we are going to talk about how to hire the right people for your startup. This, of course, is very important because you can't do everything on your own. You need to hire other talented people to help you because this is one powerful way to increase your odds for success and to get things done much faster. Now, in this episode, we're going to focus on 3 core themes: when to hire, who to hire, and how to collaborate more effectively. So let's begin with when to hire. This is easily the most difficult question to answer because every startup is different. Some startups are bootstrapping it, others are heavily funded, and of course there's an entire spectrum of everywhere in between. You might have limited funding, but not a lot of funding. So it can be very difficult to answer this question, or at least for me to provide outside advice for your startup, knowing that every startup is a little bit different. But with that said, there are 3 general rules that can help you make this decision when it comes to your specific business. Rule number 1. It's generally best to have too few people than too many. And this, of course, is very important at a startup stage because in the beginning, there are so many different ways that you can spend your time and energy. And if you have a few extra people, suddenly it's very easy to say yes to things that aren't actually that important in the very early stages of a startup business. So by having 1 or 2 few people in your business, it's easier to really focus your efforts and to remain disciplined and to understand that you need to make the most of your limited resources. So some of the things that we've talked about in this series, like defining the scope of your product, become that much more practical, that much more essential, because when you don't have excess time and energy in the form of additional employees, then you have to focus the resources that you have on fewer things. And generally speaking, this allows a startup to move much faster. So counterintuitively, it's actually better to have slightly too few people than slightly too many. Now, the one exception to this rule might be if you're in a situation where it's almost impossible to find really good people. If you're heavily funded and it's very difficult to find good people, then there can be an argument for securing people while they're available because, at a later date, they might no longer be available to hire. So there are perhaps a few situations where it does pay to recruit people well possible to make sure that you have them when you need them. But generally speaking, you want to avoid this. And this relates to the next rule, which is avoid scaling up until you've validated the core idea. One of the most common mistakes that entrepreneurs make, and I've made this mistake myself, is you have such confidence in your product, even prior to validating the idea, that in an effort to be ready to rapidly scale up and to make sure that you can keep up with demand, you start to hire additional people, anticipating that the product will be a runaway success. Now, some people do this at a much grander scale where they just assume their product is going to do so well, they end up literally hiring dozens and dozens of people. And what often happens here is the initial product, the first version, needs work. It fails right out of the gate. It needs to be improved upon. It needs to adapt. In some cases, you might need a full pivot or a full morph. And so hiring a whole bunch of other people just causes you to be that much more invested in the very first version, and it doesn't really allow you to adapt easily. So avoid the mistake of getting ahead and recruiting people when you're not actually ready. First, focus on validating the core assumption of your business, launch it to the market, be prepared to deal with some issues when it comes to scaling, but avoid making the mistake of hiring preemptively, where you just assume what you're launching is going to be a runaway success and that your number one issue is going to be not having enough people on hand to deal with this overwhelming success. Odds are that's not going to happen. It's much better to be in a position where you're needing to hire people rapidly than a situation where you've hired too many people only to find out you don't actually need them. That can be devastating for a startup. And that relates, of course, to the next rule, which is a lower burn rate buys you more time to find a sustainable model. So the idea here is when you can keep your costs low, when you avoid having a high burn rate where week in, week out, or month in, month out, you're spending a huge amount of money on staff and on other expenses in the business, well, the lower you can keep your expenses, the more of a runway you have to build a sustainable business. So even if the very first version of your product that you bring to market after conducting early customer interviews and, fine-tuning your product and refining your marketing, even after you launch the product, if it still fails to resonate with customers for any number of reasons, you have more time in which to adapt and improve the product and figure out how to get it right. Because sometimes it's not so much the product as it is the marketing or the positioning or even the audience that you're trying to sell the product to. Even with all of the research that we've talked about throughout this series and doing everything you can to deal with uncertainty, there will still be situations in which you bring your product to market only to find out that you've slightly missed the mark in some way. And so by keeping your expenses low, you buy yourself more runway. You buy yourself more time to figure out where you've gone wrong, to make changes, to improve the product or service, and then to find out how to ultimately arrive at a more sustainable business model. So with all of this in mind, the key theme here is it's better to stay conservative in the startup phase. It's better to wait until you've dealt with uncertainty and continue to gain confidence in your idea before hiring additional people. And when you hire people, hire out of necessity rather than kind of preempting a potential issue that you might see coming down the road. It's better to wait until you desperately need somebody than to hire them in advance and then ultimately not have enough for them to do, or to find things for them to do, which actually ends up distracting your business from what it is that you need to be focused on at any given point in time. Next up, let's talk about who to hire. Generally speaking, in a startup business, it is better to hire generalists rather than specialists. So you want to hire people that are more flexible and more adaptable to serve multiple roles than people that are exceptional in any given area. Now, naturally, as your business matures, it becomes more and more essential to bring on specialists, people that are exceptional at marketing or exceptional at product development or other key aspects of your business. But early on, in the startup phase, the best people to hire are those who are a cultural fit, that are willing to learn and adapt, and who are exceptionally hard workers, because this provides you with the maximum amount of flexibility, where as you gather new information, as you get a better sense of the kind of product or service that you need to build, and as you get a sense of what it is that your startup is missing, you have people that are adaptable and willing to fill roles that are unexpected. Now, some of the best people that you can hire are those that are highly entrepreneurial, but for one reason or another would prefer to work as part of your startup. You want the kind of people that, like yourself, like an entrepreneur, is ready and willing to fill the roles that need to be filled in order to get something accomplished. Now, it pays if these people do bring some specialized skills to the table. One of my favorite kind of mental models for this kind of an individual is what's called a T-shaped person. They have broad experience, they've dabbled in many different areas, and that's kind of the cross to the T, but then they have depth of knowledge in at least one area, and that's kind of the vertical bar in the T. So if you find T-shaped people that have broad experience, they've tried many things, they have a vague sense of what they're doing in a bunch of different areas, but then they have deep knowledge in one area like product development or marketing or business strategy or sales, well, then they can contribute in a big way in that area, but they're not afraid to dabble in other areas and to fill in gaps and to make sure that the startup can get everything done when perhaps you are short a team member or two because of the strategy I talked about earlier. So it's ideal to find generalists, and knowing full well that later in the business, you're going to need to recruit specialists. And fortunately, as a business does grow, there's an ongoing need for generalists when it comes to creating new products and kind of running a startup within the larger organization. Now, next, let's talk about how to collaborate more effectively as a team. Early in the startup journey, your number one priority as a startup founder is to identify priorities and to communicate them early and often with the rest of the team. There is so much going on in a startup. New information is coming in, you're trying things, you're adapting, you're adjusting the strategy, that it becomes absolutely essential that as a leader, you play the role of getting very clear on the priorities and over-communicate those priorities. Never assume just because you've mentioned something once or twice that everybody is on board. Make sure that you repeat your message early and often so that everybody understands the most important things that they can be working on. Now, related to this is the importance of having clarity behind individual roles in the startup. Now, as a business matures, there are situations in which it does pay to have redundancy, where multiple people are working on the same thing. You might have multiple people in sales, multiple people in marketing. You may have a hierarchy in place to manage things. But in a startup, you want to reduce this kind of overlap, and you want to have total clarity around who is ultimately responsible for the various things that you are focused on at the early stages of your startup. So at any given time, you might be working on things like gathering early feedback from potential customers, building a prototype of your product or service, and perhaps crafting some early drafts of your marketing messaging to get clear on how it is you're going to communicate with customers. So when it comes to these kinds of diverse roles, you want to have individual people that are taking ownership of each one of these areas. Now, of course, they're going to be openly communicating with each other. Everyone on the team is able to share ideas and suggestions with each other, but there should be individual people who have ownership and ultimate responsibility for any given area in the startup. And this allows people to have a better sense of how they can make their best contribution to the startup. If they know that at the end of the day, they're responsible for building the prototype, or they're responsible for clarifying the marketing message, or they're responsible with gathering feedback from potential customers and relaying it to the rest of the team, then they have total clarity on whether or not they are making the right contribution to the business, or whether you as the founder can assess that they aren't contributing in the way that you anticipated, and then you can either make a change and perhaps bring in a new team member to more effectively fill that role. But again, as a startup founder, it is your responsibility to have total clarity on the priorities of your startup and to be communicating those things regularly and consistently with the rest of the team. Now, if you're relatively new to entrepreneurship and you don't really have a clear sense of what to expect from the startup journey, one of the very best books that I can recommend to you is The Startup J-Curve by Howard Love. That book explains how most startups unfold in a predictable 6-step pattern. And by understanding this pattern and having a better sense of what to expect throughout the startup journey, you can increase your odds for success. But anyway, that's it for this episode. In the very next episode, we are going to talk about entrepreneurial support and accountability. This is a very underrated topic when it comes to startup success. So I'm going to share what it is that I'm doing to provide myself with accountability throughout the startup journey. And we're going to talk about some other options and ideas out there that you can turn to if you're looking for a different way to provide yourself with support and accountability. If you have any questions or comments about anything that we covered in this episode, or anything that you would like to see covered in a future episode, let me know down in the comment section. And of course, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to connecting with you again in the next one.